She played with the board, and the spirit asked for one last promise. What if I told you that a promise made on a Ouija board can span years and even find your daughter? That's exactly what happened to Julia. While playing, she heard a voice on the other side asking, "Promise me you'll release me when the time comes." She laughed and said yes. Years later, her 17-year-old daughter began repeating the same phrase, even though she'd never heard the story. And that night, something returned to collect on its promise. If you like stories of mystery, spirituality, and that chill down your spine that makes you doubt what is coincidence, now, leave a like now, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because what you're going to hear today will make you think twice before playing with the invisible. That night seemed ordinary. It was Friday, the end of another tiring week of college, and Julia had invited two friends for a relaxed evening at the small apartment she shared with a classmate. Horror movies, cheap pizza, and laughter were on the agenda, but Marcos, always the boldest of the group, brought something different that night. A Ouija board he said he'd bought at an antiques fair downtown. "It's just a joke," he said, laughing, as he took the object out of his backpack. "Let's see if this urban legend really works." The board was old. The wood was dark with age, and the slightly worn letters looked hand-engraved. The wooden pointer, shaped like a teardrop, was inside a cloth bag. As she took it out, Julia felt a shiver run down her spine. She didn't really believe in spirits, but something about the object made her uneasy. Still, she didn't want to be the annoying one who would spoil the fun. They turned off the room lights, lit a candle in the center, and sat on the floor in a circle. The mood changed instantly. The sound of traffic outside seemed distant, and even the laughter became nervous. "Is anyone there?" Marcos asked with a smirk. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then slowly the pointer moved. Julia felt her fingers grow cold. She looked at her friends, expecting someone to push it on purpose, but they seemed as scared as she was. The pointer slid to the letter S, then I, then M. The nervous laughter ceased. Julia felt her heart race. "Who are you?" he asked, not knowing where he got the courage. The pointer began to move again. This time it formed a long sentence, letter by letter. "Promise me you will free me when the time comes." The three looked at each other. "This isn't funny," muttered Camilla, her roommate, already regretting participating. The pointer continued moving, as if insistent. Julia felt a presence behind her, a chill that wasn't coming from the window. A shadow seemed to cross the wall and settle in the corner of the room. "Okay, I promise," said Julia, half laughing, half trying to lighten the mood. The moment she spoke, the candle went out on its own. The room fell into complete darkness, and a cold wind passed between them. Julia thought she heard a whisper very close by, almost inside her head. "I will remember." The lights were quickly turned on, and everyone tried to turn their fear into a joke. They put away the board and said they would never do that again. But Julia's heart was still pounding, and she was certain something had changed that night. She didn't know it, but she had just sealed a pact. The days that followed that night were strange. Julia tried to follow her routine, focusing on her studies, exams, and college responsibilities, but something lingered in the back of her mind, like an echo that kept repeating itself. "Promise me you will release me when the time comes." It was as if that phrase was engraved somewhere inside her, and the more she tried to forget it, the clearer it became. For the first week, she had nightmares. She dreamed of the candle going out on its own, of the needle moving without hands, and she always woke up in the same spot. A shadow sitting at the foot of her bed, motionless, watching her. She never saw its face, but she felt as if she were being evaluated, as if something wanted to make sure she remembered her promise. Her friends, in turn, laughed at the incident and said she was too impressed, until Marcos, the owner of the board, called one night saying he'd dreamed the same phrase, and that he'd woken up to find the board lying on the floor, even though it was stored in the closet. This completely lost Julia's sleep. It wasn't just her imagination, it was spreading. Over time, the dreams became more subtle, but more frequent. Julia began to hear the phrase in random situations, in the sound of rain, the sound of wind hitting the windows, even the sound of an old fan. "Promise me you'll set me free." It was as if the world around her was used to remind her that the promise was still active. When she graduated and left the city to begin her adult life, Julia decided to store the board in the attic of her new house, out of sight, out of mind. But even so, the weight wouldn't leave her. On stormy nights, she felt like the wind was whispering the rest of the sentence, "When the time comes." What did the time mean? And how would she know when it had arrived? Over the years, Julia got married, had her daughter Clara, and built a seemingly normal life. But that fear never went away. It was like an invisible wound, occasionally rekindling. She knew she couldn't tell anyone. Who would have believed that a promise made on a chessboard could haunt her for so many years? Once, while rocking baby Clara to sleep, Julia felt such a strong shiver that she almost dropped the child. In the corner of the room, for a moment, she saw a female figure in black, motionless, watching them. When she blinked, there was nothing there, but Julia knew. It wasn't her imagination. It was a reminder. Lying in bed that night, Julia made a silent promise to herself. She would never touch that tray again. Never. Again would she give space to whatever that presence was. But deep down, something inside her whispered, as if answering the thought, "You already promised." Time seemed to have diluted the memory, but not the weight. Julia moved on with her life. Moving cities, new jobs, the joys and losses common to adulthood. The board remained in the attic, forgotten, dusty, as if it were just an old piece of wood. And for a few years, she truly believed she was free of it. But the peace was fragile. Some nights were different. Julia would wake in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. The clock beside her bed always read 3:03. There was no noise in the house, no wind rattling against the windows, but she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. On those nights, she had the feeling she wasn't alone, as if something were standing in the hallway, waiting. Clara grew up healthy and full of energy, but Julia sometimes noticed small details that disturbed her. When her daughter was 5, she appeared in her mother's room one morning, saying she had dreamed of a woman whispering softly in my ear. Julia tried not to show fear, but her heart raced. She asked what the woman had said, and Clara replied with childlike innocence, "She said Mom needed to finish something." From that day on, Julia began locking the attic and placing heavy boxes on the access hatch. But the dreams didn't stop. Sometimes she woke to the sound of the wooden pointer hitting the board, a dry, repetitive sound, even though she was alone in the house. Other times, she smelled a burning candle coming from nowhere. The years passed, and the signs became more rare, but they never completely disappeared. Julia began to believe that perhaps it was just a psychological burden, a memory her mind couldn't erase. She became convinced that the time the spirit spoke of might never come. But deep down, a part of her knew she was wrong. The promise had no expiration date. It was like a spiritual debt, lying, dormant, waiting for the right moment to be called in. And that moment was approaching. When Clara turned 17, something changed in the house. The lights began to flicker unexplainedly. Doors creaked in the wee hours of the morning, and small objects appeared out of place. The feeling of presence returned with a vengeance, much more intense than before. Julia felt that coldness in her chest again, the same as on the night of her promise. And then, on a seemingly ordinary afternoon, she found something that made her tremble. A sheet of notebook paper on Clara's desk, with a sentence written in large letters, as if someone had guided her daughter's hand. "Promise me you will free me when the time comes." It was the same sentence, letter for letter. The silence in the house at that moment seemed alive, as if waiting for a reaction. Julia understood that the years of calm hadn't ended, just an interval. The time, after all, had come. Clara had become an introspective young woman. She liked to spend hours drawing and writing, locked in her room, listening to music at a low volume. But in recent months, Julia noticed something had changed in her daughter's behavior. Clara was paler, the circles under her eyes were deepening, and she seemed to wake up several times during the night. One night, Julia walked into the room and found her daughter sitting on the bed, eyes open, staring into the corner. The lamp was off, but there was a strange glow coming from the window. When Julia approached, Clara whispered, "Mom, she was here." Julia's heart raced. "Who was here, daughter?" "The woman. She stands in the corner and asks me to repeat something." Julia felt her body freeze. "What does she ask for?" Clara swallowed hard and said in a low voice, "She says, 'Promise me you'll set me free.'" It was as if time had stopped. Julia felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. That was the phrase she herself had heard years ago, on the night of the chess game. But she had never told that story to anyone, least of all Clara. Over the next few days, Clara began writing strange phrases in her school notebooks, as if in a trance. The words promise, time, and liberation appeared repeatedly. One night, Julia found a note left on her bedroom door, written by her daughter. "It's almost time." The atmosphere in the house grew heavy. Doors began to slam shut, lamps flickered as night fell, and the smell of burning candles returned every morning. Julia knew she could no longer ignore it. Something or someone was calling, and they were using Clara to be heard. One incident made Julia lose control of her fear. One rainy morning, she woke to the sound of someone talking in the hallway. She ran to Clara's room and found her daughter standing at her desk, pencil in hand, writing frantically. Julia approached and saw the paper written in large letters. "Promise me you will free me when the time comes." That was the complete sentence. Clara then put down her pencil, looked at her mother, and, in a voice that didn't seem to be her own, added, "The time has come." The lights in the house went out simultaneously, and a cold wind blew through the room, knocking the papers to the floor. When the power came back on, Clara was sitting on the floor, crying, unable to remember what had happened. Julia knew she had no choice. She had to face whatever was dormant in the attic. That night, Julia couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, listening to every creak in the house, as if it were a warning. Her heart was beating fast, and the air felt colder than usual. At 3 a.m, a metallic sound echoed from the attic, as if something had fallen. Julia got up slowly and climbed the steps to the trapdoor. The silence that followed was even worse. Suddenly, a sharp sound, the board pointer hitting it repeatedly as if someone was pushing it. Thump, thump, thump. Julia felt her entire body freeze. She returned to the room and found Clara sitting on the bed, her eyes wide, pointing to the corner of the room. Julia slowly turned her head and saw, just for a second, the silhouette of a woman, tall, dressed in an antique black dress, motionless. Her long hair fell over her face, and her head was slightly tilted, as if observing. The light blinked twice and went out. Clara screamed. Julia ran and hugged her daughter, feeling a chill that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The air grew so cold that their breath was visible. Then they heard a voice. It wasn't coming from Clara's mouth, nor from Julia's. It didn't come from anywhere, but it filled the entire room. Broken promise. The words echoed like a drawn-out whisper, repeating twice before fading into silence. The next morning, the house looked different. Objects had been moved. A chair in the hallway had been turned upside down. The attic door was open, even though Julia had locked it. On the floor near the stairs was a note written in Julia's handwriting. But she swore she hadn't written anything. It's time. The psychological burden had become a clear demand. Julia felt that every second of waiting made things worse. During breakfast, Clara remained silent, her gaze distant. In the end, she simply said, "You know what you need to do." Those words fell like a sentence. Julia decided she would go up to the attic that very night, even if it meant confronting something that had terrified her for years. As night fell, the atmosphere grew heavy. The house seemed smaller, the shadows thicker. Julia grabbed a flashlight and went upstairs. The attic was covered in dust, but the board was there, in the same place it had been left. Beside it, the pointer rested precisely on the letter P. As Julia picked up the object, a gust of wind ripped through the attic, knocking over boxes and scattering papers. And the same voice, now clear, spoke again. Traffic. Julia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She couldn't run anymore. The promise was alive, and it wanted to be fulfilled. The night seemed denser than usual, as if the darkness were heavy. Julia came down from the attic with the tray in her hands, covered in dust, and felt each step make the air heavier. Clara was in the living room, sitting on the sofa, as if she knew her mother would come. When she saw the object, Clara paled but showed no fear, only silent recognition. It was as if something inside her understood that this was the moment she had been waiting for. Julia placed the board on the table and wiped the dust off with a cloth. The pointer was cold to the touch, almost icy, as if it had been left outside. She sat down and took a deep breath, feeling her heart beat in time with a distant march. Daughter, do you know what this means? Julia asked, her voice trembling. Clara nodded. She said she needs to finish what she started. The room was silent for a few seconds. Then a draft swept through the room, blowing out the candle on the sideboard. The lights in the house flickered, and the pointer moved on its own to the word Sim. Julia felt her hands sweat. She looked at her daughter. If we do this, there's no going back. I know, Clara replied, with a serenity that seemed to come from somewhere else. But if we don't, she'll stay here. Julia realized the choice was no longer hers. The time mentioned so many years ago had arrived, and the spirit was making good on its promise. The two began preparing the space. They turned off all the lights, lit candles in the corners of the room, and drew the curtains. The atmosphere grew dense, and a gentle chill filled the space. Julia placed the tray in the center of the rug and invited Clara to sit next to her. When they both placed their hands on the pointer, a shiver ran through their bodies. The object began to move immediately, as if it had been waiting. It slowly formed the word, now. The air vibrated. The candles flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. Clara felt a pressure on the back of her neck and closed her eyes. What do you want from us? Julia asked. The pointer moved sharply, faster this time. FALEMMEUNOME. The letters formed something incomplete, stopping in the middle. Julia felt a chill in her stomach. She didn't remember hearing the full name that night of the promise. I don't know your name, she said, almost pleadingly. The pointer started moving again. She knows. Clara opened her eyes, and there was something different about them, as if a memory that wasn't hers had just surfaced. Mom, I know the name. Julia swallowed. Then tell me. Clara took a deep breath, but hesitated. If I say so, she'll leave. But what if she's not the only one who leaves? The board trembled under their hands, and the pointer moved to the word traffic. Julia closed her eyes. The time for choosing was over. The room was lit only by the flickering flames of the candles. The board seemed to breathe, as if it were a living being awaiting their decision. Julia looked at Clara and saw something in her daughter's face that frightened her. It wasn't just fear, it was a mixture of fascination and understanding. What if it's not just her? Clara asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. What if by freeing her, we open something we can't close? Julia felt her entire body shiver. This had been her biggest worry from the start. She remembered the shadow she'd seen years ago, motionless in the corner of the room, and the whisper she'd vowed never to forget. What if that wasn't a trapped victim, but something dangerous contained there for a reason? The pointer moved on its own, answering Clara's question. Traffic. The words sounded like an order. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing two of the candles. The shadow of the figure in black appeared reflected on the wall, even though no one was physically there. The head was tilted to the side, as if waiting. Julia took a deep breath and tried to keep her voice steady. "If I promise and tell you the name, will you leave?" The pointer formed the letters slowly, S-I-M, but then he moved again, completing E-L-E-S-N-O-O. Clara swallowed dryly. "Who are they?" he asked, but the pointer stopped, motionless. The room fell into a silence that seemed to stick to the skin. The clock on the wall stopped ticking, its ticking interrupted mid-tick. Julia felt her heart pound. It was now or never. She knelt before the board, holding the pointer in both hands. "I promise," he said, his voice firm, but his whole body trembling. "I promise I will set you free." The needle moved violently, as if confirming, and all the candles reignited simultaneously. Clara closed her eyes and began to murmur something, as if the words came from somewhere deep within her. The name began to form, syllable by syllable, until it was almost complete. But before she could finish, a loud knock echoed on the living room door. 3 sharp knocks, as if someone were outside. They both stared at each other, paralyzed. The pointer moved by itself and wrote, "Don't stop." The sound returned, louder now, as if something were trying to get in. The walls vibrated and the air became thick, difficult to breathe. Julia held her daughter's hand tightly. "Finish, Clara. Say the name." Clara took a deep breath, opened her eyes, and they shone with a strange intensity. "After this, nothing will be the same again," he said, almost in a trance. "I know," Julia replied, "but we can't go back." And then Clara said the last syllable. The last syllable left Clara's mouth like a breath of wind. Instantly, all the candles went out at once, plunging the room into dense darkness. But it wasn't ordinary pitch black. It was as if the darkness had weight, texture, as if it enveloped every object in the house. The board glowed faintly, the letters illuminated by their own light, and the pointer began to move on its own, too fast for the eyes to follow. Clara and Julia clung to each other, their hair lifted by the icy wind that now swirled through the room. Then a presence took shape in the center of the room. A tall, feminine silhouette, draped in an antique black dress, slowly emerged. It wasn't a shadow, it was something almost solid, but made of a cold, whitish light. The face was indistinct, but the eyes shone with an intensity that pierced the soul. Julia felt her whole body tremble. The air was so cold, it felt like it cut through her skin. The smell of burning candles and wet earth filled the room. Clara, still on her knees, closed her eyes and began to repeat the promise. "I promise to free you. I promise to free you." The figure approached, tilting its head as if listening to every word. The board then stopped moving, and for the first time, the voice rang out clearly, coming directly from the apparition. "Thanks for remembering." The voice wasn't frightening. It was melancholic, like someone who had waited a long time. But before Julia could respond, something strange happened. The ground shook slightly, and the doors of the house opened by themselves. A gust of wind ripped through the space, scattering papers and knocking over a chair. The figure spoke again, this time more firmly. "The promise has brought me here, but you must open the way for me." The board glowed brighter, and the letters began to form a sequence. Julia understood that she had to follow what was being shown. With a trembling voice, she repeated the words the pointer indicated, one by one. It was a chant, something she had never learned, but which seemed to be engraved somewhere in her memory. The atmosphere changed. The cold sensation gave way to a strange warmth, as if the air were charged with electricity. The candles relit themselves, but now their flames were blue. Clara began to cry, not out of fear, but out of emotion, as if she felt the pain that the entity carried. The figure in black slowly raised his hands, and a soft light emanated from his body, filling the room. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the voice spoke one last time. "It's almost done. All that's left is delivery." And then the light went out, and the figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. But the board continued to glow, as if there was still something to be done. Julia took a deep breath. She understood that the hardest part was yet to come. Freeing that soul would require more than words. It would require a choice. The glow of the board intensified, pulsing like a beating heart. The candles burned with blue flames, casting long shadows on the walls. Julia felt the air in the room grow thicker, and Clara trembled beside her, holding the pointer as if it were a link between the two worlds. What did she mean by surrender? Clara whispered. The question was answered immediately. The pointer began to move on its own, forming a clear word. What you love. Julia's chest tightened. It wasn't just any object. It was something loaded with meaning, something that represented a part of them that couldn't be recovered. Clara stood up, went to her desk, and picked up an old diary where she had been writing her secrets since she was 12. It was her most intimate possession, a collection of memories she treasured. She returned to the circle and placed the diary on the board. The candle flames rose, as if something had been accepted, but the pointer kept moving, now writing another word. You. Julia felt a lump in her throat. Me, he murmured, tears in his eyes. The pointer repeated the word, faster. You! It was as if the spirit was demanding something from her as well. Julia took a deep breath, got up, and went to her bedroom. She opened a drawer and took out a small wooden box. Inside was an old photograph, taken the day she graduated from college, the last photo before she made the promise on the board. It was a reminder of a time when she believed nothing could touch her, when the supernatural wasn't real. She returned to the living room, knelt before the board, and placed the photograph next to the diary. "It's here," he said, his voice firm despite the tears. "The last reminder of the person I was before I promised. You can take it." The board shone so brightly, it nearly blinded them both. The candles exploded with light, and the pointer moved for the last time, forming the final word, book. A warm wind swept through the room, extinguishing all the candles simultaneously. In the center of the room, the figure in black reappeared, now luminous, without the dense shadow that had previously enveloped it. Julia and Clara felt a wave of peace wash over them. The voice sounded one last time, soft, grateful. The promise was kept. "I'm going." And in a flash, the figure dissolved into particles of light that hovered in the air before disappearing. The board cracked in half on its own, as if it had served its purpose, and the pointer fell to the ground, motionless. Clara collapsed into her mother's arms, crying. But not from fear, it was relief. The house fell into absolute silence, a different silence than before, lighter, as if something had finally been resolved. But Julia knew promises have consequences. They had freed something, but they had also opened a path that could not be undone. The next morning, the house looked different. The air was lighter, as if every wall had been washed from the inside. The sun streamed through the windows with a different glow, and Clara woke smiling, saying she'd slept soundly for the first time in months. When Julia entered the room, she saw the remains of the tray still on the rug, cracked in half, with the pointer lying beside it. Clara's diary was intact, but every page was blank. Julia understood the meaning. Those memories had been taken as part of the price. In place of the photograph he had left as an offering, he found only a piece of paper with a single sentence written in delicate handwriting. Promise fulfilled. A shiver ran down her spine, but this time it wasn't fear. It was as if a great debt had been paid off. Julia took the pieces of the board, placed them in a box, and buried them in the garden under a tree. As she covered the hole with soil, she felt a gentle breeze brush her face, like a final goodbye. For weeks, the house remained silent. There were no more doors slamming on their own, no more lights flickering. Clara seemed more alive, lighter. She began writing again, but this time about peaceful dreams, about freedom, and about a woman in black who smiled before disappearing. But one full moon night, something curious happened. Julia went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, and as she passed through the hallway, she heard a faint sound coming from the living room, the sound of a piece of wood sliding against another. Her heart raced. When she looked, she saw that the pointer, which she was sure she had buried along with the tray, was on the table. Beside it, a single word scrawled on the wooden top: "Thanks." Julia smiled, even with goosebumps all over her body. She picked up the pointer, put it back in the box, and put it back in the closet, this time without fear. It was no longer a threat, but a reminder. Some promises endure, and keeping them is what maintains the balance between worlds. As he lay in bed that night, he heard a last whisper, soft as a blessing: "When another needs help, you will know." Sleep came easily, and the silence now was a silence of peace, end, or perhaps the beginning of a new story, because every promise kept paves the way for another to be made. And so, the promise was fulfilled. The spirit finally said goodbye, but left a warning. Some spiritual debts endure over time, and sooner or later they knock on the door of the one who made them. Now I want to hear from you. If it were you, would you have the courage to free this spirit, or would you rather never fulfill the promise? Leave your answer here in the comments. I'd love to hear your opinion. If this story gave you goosebumps, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and to share with those who love mysteries and dark narratives. And keep an eye out, because the next story we're going to tell could be even scarier.